Every headline you have seen about the Super El Niño building in the Pacific Ocean tells you the same things. Global temperatures will rise. Droughts will hit Australia and southern Africa. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season may be quieter, and the year might break records for global heat. That much is being covered. But there is an entire dimension of what a Super El Niño does to this world. To its food supply, its political systems, its disease burden, its energy infrastructure, its military calculations, and its long-term mortality. That is not making it into the weather segments, not into the social media posts, not into the briefings that most politicians are reading. And it is the dimension that is most consequential, because a Super El Niño in 2026 is not just a weather event. It is a threat multiplier. It takes every existing vulnerability in the global system, every conflict, every food crisis, every failing aquifer, every overstretched hospital, and it turns the dial up. This is what no one is telling you about what is coming. Let us start below the ocean surface, because the story of this El Niño is not happening where most people think it is. While the media focuses on sea surface temperatures and model probabilities, the real signal is unfolding 300 meters beneath the waves. Subsurface temperature anomalies in the equatorial Pacific have surged for 5 consecutive months heading into May 2026, according to data analyzed by researchers at the Center for Environment and Development for the Arab region and Europe. What is building down there is being described as a heat battery, an enormous reservoir of stored thermal energy that is beginning to discharge. The mechanism driving that discharge is a series of Kelvin waves, massive pulses of thermal energy acting as a conveyor belt moving from the waters near Indonesia eastward toward the South American coast. These Kelvin waves are invisible at the surface right now. They cannot be felt in Miami or Manila or Mumbai, but they are there. And when they arrive at the surface, they will raise sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern equatorial Pacific past the threshold that defines El Niño, and potentially past the 2.0 degrees Celsius anomaly that defines a Super El Niño. The surface conditions we are watching right now, as alarming as they already appear, are only the leading edge of what the deep ocean is already sending our way. The pace at which this is developing is itself part of the untold story. Sidar's analysis describes current conditions in the tropical Pacific as a deceptive atmospheric ceasefire, neutral on the surface but with subsurface telemetry that is, in their own words, screaming toward a shift. Private meteorologist Brian Bledsoe stated publicly that the rate of warming coming out of La Niña into this developing El Niño is probably the fastest he has ever seen in his professional career. The University of Hawaii at NOAA Research Group, which developed a forecasting model capable of predicting El Niño and La Niña up to 15 months in advance using ocean surface temperature and height observations, is currently projecting the development of a strong El Niño with Pacific sea surface temperatures more than 2.0 degrees Celsius above normal, the Super El Niño threshold, toward the end of 2026. Their model, tested against 6 decades of historical ENSO data, demonstrated what researchers described as surprisingly strong predictive skill at that extended range, and what it is currently showing is not being talked about at the scale it deserves. Now here is the dimension that the mainstream weather coverage is almost entirely missing. What happens when a Super El Niño arrives in a world already fractured by war, already stressed by inflation, already dependent on supply chains that run through one of the most geologically and politically volatile regions on the planet? The Iran conflict and the disruption it caused to oil and gas flows through the Strait of Hormuz triggered what the Center for Climate and Security described as the largest oil shock since World War II. That shock started spiking global oil prices and regional liquefied natural gas prices even before shipments began failing to arrive from their weeks-long journeys to recipient nations. The intersection of that supply chain collapse with a developing Super El Niño creates what CDR analysts called a perfect storm for food insecurity, because climate-driven crop failures combine with high fertilizer and fuel costs in a way that is geometrically worse than either crisis would produce alone. Chris, Climate Intelligence Unit, explained the mechanism directly. Food prices, he said, are being squeezed from both sides. By climate extremes disrupting production in major growing regions, and by a food system still hooked on fossil fuels and exposed to spikes in gas, fertilizer, transport, and packaging costs. A Super El Niño, he continued, can turbocharge weather risks in a climate already destabilized by human emissions, compounding inflation driven by high fossil fuel prices. The fertilizer angle of this story is one of the most important and least discussed. Nitrogen fertilizers, the compounds that underpin the productivity of modern agriculture across virtually every major crop-producing region in the world, require enormous amounts of natural gas to manufacture. When natural gas prices spike, fertilizer prices spike. When fertilizer becomes expensive or unavailable, farmers reduce application rates or switch to less productive varieties. Yields fall, food output declines. And those yield declines arrive on the global market at exactly the moment when El Niño is also reducing harvests in Australia, India, Indonesia, and Southern Africa. Paul Donovan, chief economist at UBS, put it plainly in an analysis published in late March 2026. Higher fertilizer prices may not be the biggest agricultural price threat this year. A super El Niño pattern, he noted, means drought, and limited water supply might be more important than shortages of nitrogen. He is saying that even if the fertilizer supply chain stabilizes, the water will not be there to grow the food. Both crises, energy-driven fertilizer scarcity and El Niño-driven water scarcity, are arriving at the same time. The United Nations World Food Programme warned in a recent analysis that the number of food insecure people across the globe could reach levels last seen at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. That was a global emergency, and the WFP is warning we may be returning to that level. The commodities most directly exposed to El Niño price pressure are ones that hundreds of millions of people depend on daily: rice, cocoa, food oils, sugar. These are the staple and semi-staple commodities whose prices hit hardest in the developing world, where household food budgets are tightest, where the share of income spent on food is already above 50% in many communities, and where price spikes translate most directly into reduced caloric intake, malnutrition, and child development impacts that will be felt for decades. India are all specifically identified by analysts as countries significantly exposed to El Niño disruption, each for different reasons. India because its monsoon is weakened. Australia because it is in drought. Brazil because its weather patterns shift in ways that damage coffee and soy production. Argentina because its agricultural zones overlap with El Niño's precipitation anomalies in South America. The European Union has already warned that an El Niño event later this year threatens northwestern Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Sudan with dry conditions, posing a significant risk to the main agricultural season in those regions. The disease dimension of what a super El Niño does to this planet is the one that public health experts describe as deeply underestimated by the general public and critically by most governments. During and after El Niño events, cholera incidence has been found to increase threefold in El Niño-sensitive areas in East Africa, a direct consequence of the higher rainfall that overwhelms sanitation systems and contaminates water sources. The warmer temperatures and altered rainfall patterns that El Niño produces across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America create ideal breeding conditions for disease vectors. Mosquitoes that carry malaria, dengue fever, and Zika virus. When health systems in developing countries are simultaneously overwhelmed by climate-driven disease outbreaks and the food insecurity that weakens human immune function, the mortality that results is spread across years and is almost never attributed to El Niño in news coverage. Research cited by Zero Carbon Analytics shows that El Niño events do not just cause short-term disruption. They can slow improvements in mortality for years, reducing life expectancy and generating substantial long-term economic losses in high-income Pacific Rim countries, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Chile, Japan, and South Korea. These are not developing world-only outcomes. This is a long-tail mortality event that affects wealthy nations too, through mechanisms that almost never appear in weather event casualty reports. The energy infrastructure vulnerability that a super El Niño creates in Asia is a specific and deeply serious story that geopolitical analysts are now urgently tracking. Strong El Niño conditions are projected to exacerbate Asia's existing energy and agricultural challenges, increasing risks of drought, wildfires, and critically, hydropower shortages, particularly in regions already dependent on hydropower for the bulk of their electricity generation. In 2024, drought caused by the previous El Niño progressively depleted water resources in parts of southern Africa, with low water levels at Kariba Dam reducing hydropower generation for most of Zambia and Zimbabwe. When hydropower fails in a country that depends on it for 80 or 90% of its electricity, the cascading consequences reach into every sector of the economy simultaneously. Industrial production drops, hospitals strain, food processing halts, and water pumping systems for agriculture fail. That scenario, which played out in southern Africa in 2024, is now being projected as a possibility for multiple Asian nations in the second half of 2026, at a moment when the Iran conflict has already disrupted the fossil fuel supply chains that would normally be the backup for hydropower shortfalls. The political and security dimension of a super El Niño arriving in 2026 is one that intelligence analysts and security researchers have been tracking, but that has not broken into mainstream discussion. The Center for Climate and Security published a detailed analysis in late April 2026, making the case that El Niño will supercharge the shocks already being generated by the Iran war. In Europe, the combination of heightened extreme weather and the conflict's shocks to energy and food prices will strain infrastructure and economies in ways that give Russia more openings for its disinformation and hybrid warfare playbook. Moscow has regularly exploited disasters, energy costs, and farmer protests to undermine and divide its adversaries. And it maintains leverage as a key grain, fertilizer, and gas supplier, including in the Caucasus along NATO's eastern flank. During the 2024 El Niño event, Europe saw devastating flooding in Spain, Poland, and elsewhere. And those floods prompted Russian disinformation campaigns specifically designed to undermine governments and weaken NATO unity. A Super El Niño in 2026 will produce more floods, more droughts, more disasters, and more public anger at governments that appear unable to protect their populations. Each of those events is an opportunity for adversarial information operations targeting Western democratic institutions. The political instability that El Niño drives through food price, shocks, and water scarcity is not a theoretical projection. It is documented history. Research published over the past 2 decades has confirmed a consistent statistical relationship between strong ENSO events and elevated rates of civil conflict, particularly in nations with high agricultural dependence, weak institutions, and populations already experiencing food stress. Seder's analysis of the 2026 outlook is explicit. The resulting scarcity of water and food, particularly in agricultural regions, is expected to fuel community-level tensions, localized conflicts, and water-related protests. Countries like Iraq, Syria, and others in the Arab region face specific risk of drought-related disputes as the event intensifies through late 2026. Many Arab nations already face depleted fiscal buffers that limit their ability to respond to simultaneous climate and economic shocks. The Arab region is highly vulnerable to global food price volatility, particularly for rice, sugar, and food oils, and a Super El Niño is expected to increase that volatility significantly. The compounding nature of these crises, food, water, energy, disease, and political instability, all arriving simultaneously, is what separates a Super El Niño from an ordinary severe weather event. Kaveh Madani, director of the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, has issued a formal warning about what he calls global water bankruptcy, the process by which El Niño-induced droughts in places like South Asia and Southern Africa force farmers and governments to extract groundwater far faster than it can naturally replenish. Ancient aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being drained in years. When those aquifers are gone, they do not come back on any time scale relevant to human civilization. The crops those aquifers irrigated cannot be grown. The communities those aquifers sustained cannot survive in place. And the migration pressures that result, tens of millions of people displaced from agricultural regions that can no longer support them, create humanitarian and political crises that make every other challenge harder to manage. The 2015 to 2016 Super El Niño, the last event of comparable scale to what is now being projected, affected approximately 60 million people through disease, displacement, and severe socioeconomic insecurity. That figure is sobering. But what makes the 2026 projection more alarming is the baseline on which this event is arriving. In 2015, global temperatures were lower than they are today. The decade of additional human-caused warming since then has raised the floor. When the 2015 Super El Niño struck, it struck a somewhat cooler, somewhat more resilient world. The 2026 event strikes a world that is already at the warmest point in recorded human history, already in the worst spring drought in 131 years of American records, already dealing with the food and energy consequences of geopolitical conflict, already seeing the UN World Food Program warn that food insecurity is approaching levels not seen since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. The 2026 El Niño does not create these crises, it multiplies them. One study published in March 2026 found that the pace of global warming has nearly doubled since 2015. The implications of that finding extend far beyond the temperature record itself. When warming accelerates, extreme events that were once rare become frequent. Events that were once possible become probable. Events that were once manageable become catastrophic. The researchers at UCLA, working on heatwave analysis, have documented that even small increases in global temperature dramatically increase the frequency and severity of long-duration heat waves, and that the underlying warming trend makes previously unlikely heat events much more plausible. A Super El Niño layered on top of a climate system that is warming at double the pace it was warming a decade ago is not twice as dangerous as the 1997 to 1998 or 2015 to 2016 events. It is many times more dangerous because the baseline has shifted in ways that compound every hazard the El Niño produces. There is one aspect of the 2026 El Niño story that almost no mainstream coverage is addressing directly. And it is the one that Kaveh Madani and the team at Zero Carbon Analytics both identified as critically understudied, the socioeconomic and political knock-on effects that lack sufficient clarity and investigation. These include global market impacts that travel through supply chains in ways that are difficult to predict in advance. They include human migration patterns that shift when agricultural systems fail in specific regions, and they include links to political instability that are statistically documented, but almost never attributed to El Niño when they make the news. When farmers in Kenya cannot grow enough food because of the El Niño drought, and food prices spike, and young men without economic prospects join. Armed groups, the resulting conflict rarely gets a headline that says it was caused by El Niño. But the causal chain is there. It has been documented. And a Super El Niño in 2026 is going to produce that causal chain across multiple countries simultaneously. In Africa, in South Asia, in Central America, and potentially in parts of the Middle East that are already combustible from existing conflict. The long-term economic damage that El Niño events impose on the countries they strike is another dimension of the story that falls almost entirely outside the weather coverage and even most of the policy discussion. Research shows that El Niño events can slow improvements in mortality for years in affected regions, reducing life expectancy and generating substantial long-term economic losses, not just in developing nations, but in high-income Pacific Rim countries, including the United States, Canada, and Australia. The mechanism is not just acute disaster. It is the cumulative impact of reduced agricultural output on rural incomes, disrupted school attendance during disaster and displacement periods, nutrition deficits in childhood that affect cognitive development, and lifetime earning potential, and health system burdens that divert public resources from preventive care into emergency response. These effects unfold over years and decades. They are never attributed to El Niño in economic data. They are just there, quietly embedded in the mortality statistics and GDP trajectories of countries that experienced a strong event, years or decades earlier. A Super El Niño in 2026 will embed its consequences into the economic and health trajectories of multiple countries in ways that will still be visible in data analyses conducted in 2035 and 2040, long after the event itself has been forgotten by casual news consumers. The prescription that climate researchers and security analysts are offering for this convergence of threats is not complicated. Madani described it clearly. The current era requires a fundamental shift from reactive crisis management to proactive climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Historically, populations and governments addressed climate hardships reactively, responding with emergency relief only after disasters occur and water resources are already depleted. That reactive model was barely adequate for previous El Niño events. For a Super El Niño arriving in 2026 on top of the existing stresses to the global food, energy, water, and political systems, reactive management is not adequate. The window for preparation? The period between now and when the event peaks, which most models project in the October to December 2026. Window with its largest global temperature effects delayed into 2027 is the only window that exists. It is measured in months, and most governments are not using it. The Super El Niño of 2026 is building 300 meters beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Kelvin waves are carrying stored heat eastward. Subsurface anomalies have surged for 5 consecutive months. The ECMWF's full ensemble of models pointed unanimously toward a strong event by mid-June. NOAA gives El Niño a 61% probability of emerging in the coming months, with a 1 in 4 chance of a very strong event. The WMO has issued its formal warning. The WFP has warned that food insecurity could approach Ukraine war-era levels. Security analysts are documenting the pathways by which El Niño will amplify the Iran war's shocks. Disease researchers are projecting cholera surges and vector-borne illness spikes across multiple continents. Energy infrastructure analysts are tracking hydropower vulnerability across Asia. All of this is happening. All of it is documented. All of it is being communicated between specialists in closed briefings and scientific papers. And almost none of it is breaking into the conversation that ordinary people are having about what this El Niño means for their world. The weather coverage will tell you about the drought in Australia and the rainfall in South America. What it is not telling you is about the Kelvin waves in the deep Pacific, the food price squeeze between climate and conflict, the cholera outbreaks that follow the floods, the aquifers that will not recover, the disinformation campaigns that will ride the disasters, the migration that will follow the failed harvests, and the compounding, multiplying, cascading consequences of a Super El Niño arriving on the most stressed version of this planet that has ever existed. That is what no one is telling you. And the time to understand it is now, before the heat battery beneath the Pacific finishes.